Okay, I've decided to create a short little video here to show you a little bit about the book. In case this is the book that I'm looking at. If you're looking at it online, you may see a cover, but it probably look a little bit different. I don't know how the layout is online. I don't really access it online, but I will make sure to get the scans and stuff if I can. Actually, I will for the first couple of weeks. And then after that, I'll try to get everything up there. I think I can access everything that I'm going to take from this. And then I, of course, have my own little stash of things that I can grab from in terms of the readings. All of the readings should have links either in the assignments or I will create sort of a separate folder where you can access it. It'll really just depend on sort of how I can load it and what makes sense in terms of simplicity of use. But as you read in the instructions, you'll see little links to some of these readings, and my intention, at least, is to get you to access them through there. But I should be able to create sort of a separate folder for all of the readings if necessary. But anyway, what I'm looking at right now is sort of the book that I'm using. It's an older edition, and I did that intentionally because most of the readings in here are easily accessible, even like with a, I'd say like 80% of them are available with like a Google web search. The only thing you may run across is that the excerpts in here may be a little bit shorter than the ones that you could access online. So it's to your benefit to access my links, even if you do have to sort of find the readings on your own. You may just do a little bit more reading than you really need to. But all of the stuff that I'll be taking will be from the links, either from the excerpts or in most cases, I'm guessing, not guessing, I know most of them are going to be full length. So you shouldn't run into that problem too many times. But that being the case, I thought I'd show you a little bit about what it looks like. The preface, I don't think I assigned that. But then there's the tables of contents. One thing to note about the table of contents at first is that it is broken down into different units. I don't necessarily follow these units per se. I may like grab things from each section. I don't have like I think at least I have a section just on exclusively democracy, right? It'll be something more like political theory and stuff like that. But as you work through the units, there should be a natural progression. I'm hoping as you work through the units to see kind of how they work together, and then at the end of most of the units. Most at a certain point after the little intros and preliminary readings, the stuff the actual formal papers that you're going to be writing with bibliographies and stuff, which we'll get into a little bit here, but then we'll also get into it a lot more in the 108. Those are going to be kind of if you read the prompts in a way that ties all of these things together, I think you'll start to see how I'm building up the ideas. But that being the case, the prompt is really going to be probably the most natural and direct application of the readings overall. Like if you want to look for like some kind of connective tissue, you can look at sort of the subheadings on the units. But then as you pause to do the writing for it, like the formal writing, you'll find, I think, that it ties things together in terms of how you're using it, probably a little more explicitly than you could get maybe like day to day. Each individual lesson, it may not sort of click until you get maybe to that final paper that you have to write on the unit as a whole. So that's just a little sort of, not quite a warning, but just an explanation that there is going to be a slight difference in terms of how this is broken down and how the class is broken down. But I do like these. I mean, it's like, wealth and poverty, education. It's pretty clear. And I think at some points I'm going to assign some of these little intros, and of course I'll scan them for you because they're generally not going to be accessible other than maybe this book. Or unless you have it online. Obviously, if you access it online, which I can assume that most of you are going to, that it shouldn't be that big of a stretch. But I'll try to get these introductions scanned because I know that might be a little bit of an issue for some of you that may wind up not getting the books right away. But that being the case, these little intros are pretty good, and I'll probably be selective about how I use them. The assignment that I have for you in terms of the reading that's attached to this is the first 11 pages. I do want you to read those, and I will provide a link to that if it's kind of above this video, or maybe it's below, but it's on this page. But this is the first 11 pages, like the formal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know how close I need to get. the actual, not like the II or IV or whatever, the Roman numerals. But like 1 through 11 is the first little section that gives you some examples of how to review the material, how it's broken down, some stuff about critical reading and critical writing, which I'll get into a little bit more as we progress, especially like in the 108. I may pause and spend a little bit more time on it than I would in just the formal 300 units. But then after you get past that, you have this whole big section that I also told you to look over. This is writing about ideas. It's an introduction to rhetoric. And rhetoric is kind of a broad term. You may have been used to seeing it before in terms of perhaps like speech, sort of formal speech, rhetoric. That kind of gives you a good outline of what's going on. But it's sort of a slightly more formal process, or well, maybe not more formal, but a slightly different process when you sort of formally committed to writing. Rhetoric is really just about how things are put together in terms of communication, more so than maybe not necessarily just what is being said, but how it's being said. Okay, any message, how it's being said is something that you can investigate along with sort of your understanding about the message itself. Okay, so it's a slightly more and that gets into a little bit of the critical reading and critical writing, the critical aspect of it. Now, criticism doesn't mean this isn't in the sense of criticism, as in you criticize it, right? It's like, no, I don't agree with that, right? That's criticism, or this is bad or this is good. Critical means critically taking things apart, okay? Being critical about how you sort of advance through the parts of whatever you're reading. Okay, so critical just means you're taking it apart, almost literally, and then kind of seeing how those pieces work. Okay, so when you critically evaluate something, you're not just accepting it at face value, right? You may be reading into it a little bit, or you may be just looking at sort of a little bit more analysis than you would normally put. Maybe the analysis is presented to you, but maybe you need to know something about sort of what the author's point of view is, what the audience for it is, going into a little bit more of a rhetorical understanding, again, and evaluating it at sort of a critical level and saying, okay, what do I bring to the table? How can I understand this? Or how is this being understood? Okay, that's what I think it means by critical evaluation. And one of the things I like about this big section, even though I don't necessarily have you reading like, memorizing it and, responding to it all the time, is that it gives you a good background of sort of how you can approach these readings and how you can approach maybe even your writing. Okay, it's got a lot of good hints about sort of, useful quotations. I'll hold that even a little closer. Useful quotations, right? Sort of how you can use those. Simple questions you can ask yourself. Sample questions, I should say, about how you can ask, what you can ask about the reading, and it gives you some examples. In this case, it's Freud. It's a little outdated, but whatever. Freud is interesting, at least, right? That's at his whole. This has a section on Oedipal complex, which is kind of a weird thing, but don't let that dissuade you. And then later on, it goes into a little bit more about thesis statements. If you don't know what a thesis statement is, pay attention in 108, if nothing else. You should at this point, if you're in a 300 class, you should probably be at least aware that an essay comes in parts. This reading kind of in this whole section kind of breaks it down a little bit more detail than I can do sort of as a whole. I will give you some instruction in that in 108 because it is a support class and it's designed to sort of help you out in that context, among others. And I'll be using for that class They Say, I Say, which is a little bit more exercises and stuff like that, and actual examples of of each kind of what's a good thesis statement. How does an essay get put together? What are the parts? How do we approach understanding how we're using information? All of that stuff in 108 I go into probably a little bit more thoroughly and in detail than you could do in sort of as walking through these units. Although I do try to introduce. Each time I introduce you to a concept, I try to explain it even in 300, like in a prompt. I'm not going to just say, write an essay, period, and, give you like a question. The prompts are going to be a little more involved in that, especially at first where I kind of say, in this essay, you'll be expected to, and I'll give you a little bit more context, given your understanding of blah, 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 and then I'll reference maybe an essay that you've read, or maybe you'll bring an essay to the table when we get a little bit deeper into the course in terms of research and stuff. And then it also gives you some hints about development of ideas, development by definition in this case, which, for example, definition as in an essay, definition is essential for two purposes: to make certain that you have a clear grasp of your concepts and that you communicate a clear understanding to your reader. Okay, reader and writer, right? Pretty basic concepts that it's using that you're gonna have some use for. Okay, so if you haven't written a whole lot of academic papers, and at this point, since some of you guys are going to be in the 108, maybe just coming into using 108 as a developmental sort of writing toward 300, you may not have as much formal understanding of essay. That's okay, it's fine. In an online format, it gets a little tricky because I can present to you some ideas, I can give you the reasons for them, I can show you a little bit about how to use them, but it's helpful to be maybe a little bit more proactive if you already know kind of, hey, I've never really written thesis statements before, or it's been like 10 years, or, in high school I had a real problem with that. Stuff like that are things you might want to bring up, not necessarily just in the units as I explore them, like in 108, for example. But in the 300, it really is just going to be presenting to you ways to apply some of this knowledge, maybe giving you some hints about where to go, getting you to understand that you need to use the material that you have, and then maybe provide some analysis, some further analysis. But 300 is kind of limited in the sense that I give you readings, I have you respond to them, I give you some exercises, maybe some in-class stuff, and maybe a little bit of homework, so to speak, to do, and then I have you apply them. Okay, apply those concepts. We may have some room for some revision activities and stuff like that, but for the most part in 300, things move maybe a little bit faster than they would in like what used to be, the 101, which is a more developmental writing idea, which is kind of what I'm trying to use the 108 for, is to sort of that slow down process, and then maybe some ways that you can go more in depth in each one of the individual topics. We can even just start, spend a whole class talking about topics, and how we discover topics based on the readings that we had in 300. For some of you, that may be a little bit basic, but I do design it so that everybody can get something out of it. But I won't talk too much about the 108, except to say that if it looks on its face as you go through a unit that it moves a little fast, or at least in terms of presenting you with information, that's kind of what 300 does. It just provides you information and then gets you to apply it, and then later on so that you can engage in that process yourself with research. In 108, we slow down a lot and we use it as a support class. And if you do have some experience with some of these, pipe up, help your fellow students out. But in either case, there's range and room for everything. And introducing you, getting you to look at some of these initial readings and the book itself, in terms of the introduction and some of those concepts, gives you at least a vocabulary, even if you are familiar with sort of some of the concepts, gives you a vocabulary so that you can use it in this class, so that we're all sort of speaking the same language. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to bring them up. But for now, I will say goodbye, and I will follow up in just a little bit after you've been able to click through some more.